All right. Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? All right. It's so wonderful to be here with you today at Gordon. A beautiful day, a beautiful house of prayer and worship. What I would like to share with you today is more of my personal story and more of my history and the work that I am engaging in now. And for me, as I'm speaking, what I would like for you to do is not to listen to this as what is happening over there, but I think as being part of one community, of one family, of one church, to really look into yourself and ask, how are we living these teachings in our lives? I know the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a conflict that's very far away for many of you, geographically very far away. And I know many of you are living daily conflicts that are really close to you and dear to you. And I think part of what we do together when we engage in having this discussion as a family is we help each other deal with our conflicts. What I've learned, what I've experienced may be able to help you. And the things that you experience may be able to help me. Not about arguing or debating, but about seeing how are we truly trying our best to live what Christ calls us to do. When I begin my presentations, I begin by saying I'm a Palestinian Christian. And then usually after my presentations, we open it up for question and answer. So we're not gonna have time for Q&A. So I'll give you the first question that is usually asked of me. If you're a Palestinian and you're a Christian, when did you convert? The idea is that if you're a Palestinian, you're an Arab. If you're an Arab, you're a Muslim. That means at one point, you're a Muslim who converted and became a Christian. And of course, for many Americans, the assumption is that I converted on the hands of a great American white pastor who visited the Holy Land. My answer is, yes, as a family, we probably did convert. We were non-Christians and we became Christians. And I hold this fact to be truth until somebody disputes it, that my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather actually converted during a time called Pentecost in Jerusalem. You may have heard of that time. That's how far we go back in the Holy Land. At least on record, as a family, we go back 600 years. So we could easily have gone 2,000 years back. So the Palestinian Christians have always been there. And the Christian community has always been in the land itself. If you read Acts 2, during that time of Pentecost, you would actually see that one of the tongues that the disciples spoken was Arabic, which is my native language. But of course, we only have about half an hour, so I cannot give you my 2,000-year history as a family. I'm going to jump straight into modern times. If you talk to Palestinians and Israelis about their personal story, one of the first lines we both use, which is exactly the same line, we start by saying, in 1948. And then we have two different stories. In 1948, if you remember from reading history, the State of Israel was established, a home for the Jewish people who had been suffering, a time of celebration for Jews and many people around the world. While the world and the Jewish community was celebrating the establishment of the State of Israel, as Palestinians, we faced what's called the Nakba, which means catastrophe. It was a catastrophe for us during that time. My father's family comes from Jerusalem. My father lived right outside the old city. It's the story of my father, not me, what you're sharing. And my father lived in a home that the family owned. There were 7 children with their parents. One of the things that we seem to forget, even the people who live in the land, in the Holy Land, is a simple fact that at one point in our life, Jews, Christians, and Muslims actually lived as good neighbors with each other in that land. If you hear somebody tell you that this is a historic, intractable conflict that's been going on for thousands of years, don't believe them. Yes, this land, like many lands around the world, has faced many conflicts and many wars. But each conflict had its beginning, had its end, had its purpose, had its results. This is not just one long time war that's been going on for 2,000 or 3,000 years like some would say. I would actually challenge those who say this and say these are people who are not looking for peace because they don't want you to get involved. It's been going on forever. You can't do anything about it. In this neighborhood outside Jerusalem where my father lived, outside the old city, as I said, Jews, Christians, and Muslims actually lived in that neighborhood. And they were very good neighbors with each other. When the war broke out, my grandfather was killed in the war. He was killed as a civilian. He wasn't involved in any combat. He was actually killed raising a white flag on top of their home to show both sides that there are innocent civilians living there. And he was shot by a sniper. The tragedy for the family did not end just with the death of the father. A few days later, when the Jewish forces took over that neighborhood, they demanded that all the non-Jews leave their homes. So the Christians and the Muslims had to leave. The Jewish families that lived there actually tried their best to defend the right of their neighbors to stay, but they couldn't do anything about it. So my father, his siblings, and the mother became part of that mass population of refugees, Palestinian refugees. You may have heard about them. About 800,000 people became refugees at that time. They lost their homes, their lands, their possessions. My grandmother with her children moved to Bethlehem because she had a brother who was living there who was pastoring a local church. She couldn't afford to take care of the family, so she ended up sending her children to orphan homes. And my father ended up in an orphanage, now back in Jerusalem. In an orphanage that wasn't far away from his neighborhood where he lived, where every day he could actually see that neighborhood. He couldn't get to it. And a neighborhood now that in his house there was a Jewish family that was living there, Jewish children that were playing where he used to play, maybe not even knowing that his father is buried in the courtyard of this house. Now, if you put yourself in that position of this 9-year-old child, what are the feelings, what are the emotions that such a child would experience? Losing everything. His father, his home, his private schooling, his friends, everything, and now living in a very, very poor orphanage. Hatred, anger, bitterness, revenge, retaliation. We would actually call this, normal. That's how any person should react to a situation like this. One person we are thankful for is my grandmother. My grandmother was a faithful person, and she insisted and taught her children and us as grandchildren that revenge and retaliation was not going to achieve anything for us as Palestinians. It wasn't going to get their father back. It wasn't going to get their home back. It wasn't even going to attain a sense of justice for what we lost. We would just be retaliating, hurting others for what happened to us. But at the same time, she taught us that remaining silent in the face of injustice is not the Christian way, that we are called to be peacemakers, and proactively seeking peace and reconciliation is what the message of Christ is about. That was the seed my grandmother planted in our hearts. She passed away a few years ago. One of the messages that she kept saying, even until she passed away, was that she doesn't even want us to find out who killed her husband. Because she would say that if that person knew my husband, he wouldn't have pulled the trigger. So we need to forgive them and move on. Jumping to my story. I was born in the US because my father was blessed to have been adopted actually by an American family, and they took him to the US where he continued his education, went back home, married my mother, came back here, and I was born in a beautiful city called Kansas City. How are the Chiefs this year, right? Good. Chiefs fans? No? All right, one. Thank you. But we went back home when I was 6 months old because my father got a job offer to run a local orphanage in Bethlehem. Not the orphanage he grew up in, but he immediately said yes. So I grew up all of my life in Bethlehem, not far away from where Jesus was born. But I grew up in a time when we lived as Palestinians under what's called direct Israeli military occupation, where everything about our life was controlled by the Israeli military. And if you ask me as a child growing up to define an Israeli, as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old child, who is an Israeli to you? For me, the answer was very simple. There were soldiers and settlers. This is who Israeli society was. Soldiers had guns, settlers, who were a group of people that were living in Palestinian land, building homes and confiscating land. They also had guns, and they were very violent towards us, very abusive towards us, and we were to fear them, we were to hate them. Very simple. Every Israeli was either a soldier or a settler. Soldiers wore uniforms, settlers wore civilian clothes, but they had guns. And I, as a child, started growing up with these emotions of hatred towards them, because I saw how they treated us. I saw how they treated my father in the orphanage that he was working in. Soldiers who were just a few years older than me were abusing my father on the street, and I started hating them. At the same time, I'm challenged with what my grandmother and my father and mother are telling me. We are to love them. We are to seek peace with them. And I remember as a 9-year-old child arguing with my father, not about toys and Legos. We had a thing called Atari at that time. I don't know if you guys know this. Some people know Atari. Wow. That's what children used to fight for and argue their parents about. I was arguing with my father politically. How dare you ask us to make peace with them, and look what they're doing to us. And I was never able to connect these two narratives, these two realities. Seek peace, but a reality of war. It wasn't until I was 12 years old that an uncle of mine who had been living in the US came back and started a center to teach nonviolence to the Palestinian community. He had studied Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King in the US, and the civil rights movement. And my uncle Mubarak said, as Palestinians, we could actually reconcile these two narratives, that we could resist and we could fight for our liberation and freedom and dignity, and at the same time, we could do it nonviolently, without terrorism, without violence, without hurting those who are doing this to us. And that was the beginning of my journey and my path to understanding nonviolence. Two things happened in working with my uncle. The first was a realization that Israeli society was much bigger and much broader and had much more in it than my perception. For the first time in my life, I met Israeli peace activists, Israeli Jews who were neither soldiers nor settlers, but who were people fully committed to making peace with the Palestinians, who understood that their government was doing something wrong, who understood that there was an injustice, and that they did not want their government to continue this work. And that really changed my life, to see Israelis who were really committed to peace with the Palestinians. The other thing that happened in 1988 was my uncle was arrested by the Israeli government. He was put on trial. It was a very big trial, very well publicized, lots of media attention. US government even got involved because my uncle was a US citizen at that time. And he was put on trial because of his work in nonviolence. The Israeli government and military, and I say government and military, not the people, but these institutions started seeing my uncle as a threat. And my uncle was actually deported. He was kicked out from the country, from his birthright place, because of his work in nonviolence. The Israeli High Court labeled him as a threat to the national security of Israel. And he was deported, not allowed to ever return and live back, even until this day. And for me, that was a big question. A nonviolent peace activist is a threat? I mean, I know my uncle. I've never seen him say anything violent about Israelis, let alone do something. So what is that power of nonviolence that makes Israel see my uncle as a threat? And that's when I committed my life to studying and engaging in this work. Jumping to where I am now and the work that I'm engaging in. In 1998, I came back from the US and started this organization called Holy Land Trust. Our work as an organization is strengthening the communities for the future. What we do is we look at the challenges that face the communities and ask what is needed and what is missing in the communities that can allow them to become a voice for peace, no matter what this community is. And to reach this point, it's been a process. Because when I started the organization initially, it was about strengthening the Palestinian community, the weaker party, the victim, the oppressed. How can we as victims deal with the victimizer, and how do we teach nonviolence to deal with this? And if you asked me 10 years ago and 15 years ago with this organization, if as a Christian I was following the teachings of Jesus, I would actually say yes. For me, I had a whole logical argument in saying how Jesus would stand with the oppressed against the oppressor, with the victim against the victimizer, with the occupied against the occupier, with the poor against the rich, and you name it, in whatever context that you're working in. And that's the argument I would make. Jesus would stand, and he would use nonviolence to fight the oppressor, the occupier, the victimizer. He wouldn't do it violently. And that was my logic behind nonviolence. But a few years ago, as I was reading the gospel, reading the Bible, like hopefully many of us do, I was struck by reading in the Sermon on the Mount, which I've read many times, and I heard tens, if not hundreds of sermons about it, by three words that popped out from the Bible that for me felt as if it was for the first time I'm hearing these words. And these words were, Sami, I don't want you to resist and fight your enemy. I want you to love your enemy. And my first reaction was, Jesus, I wish you never said these words. And then, of course, the next question is, what do you mean? As a Palestinian, as your follower, you want me to love the enemy. Of course, you can imagine me sitting, in bed now beginning to laugh at myself because I'm creating these images and I'm having this argument with Jesus. Like, so what do you want me to do? Go to a bunch of Israeli soldiers, open my arms up? I'll say, come on. You know you want it. Give me a hug. I love you, man. I think the soldiers might do something else to me. What does it mean to love the enemy? Yeah, and again, look in your life. Those who, for whatever reason in your life, you've now have a relationship of animosity with, of hatred, bitterness, violence with. It could be from your family, your neighborhood, an ethnic group, a racial group, a different nation, a different country, a different religion. How are we to love them? What does it mean to love the enemy? And it's so easy just to dismiss the sentences that we don't want to engage in. And I tried. For many days, I said, yeah, no, it's about resisting them. I'll do it non-violently, Jesus. I won't hurt them. But I can't love them. The first thing I realized after that was that it's a commandment. Jesus doesn't give us an option on this one. He doesn't say, I would like for you to consider loving your enemy. Or if I were you, I would love my enemy. Or out of several options, how about loving your enemy? It's a clear-cut commandment. The next thing I realized is that it is not just about peacemaking, even though we are called to be peacemakers, but I think that's a step into that direction. And it's not about negotiating a peace treaty. Because if we look at the context of the conflict and the situation that Jesus lived, actually, it wasn't that much different than the situation in the Holy Land today. There was the Roman occupation, and there was the Jews who were living under the Roman occupation and suffering, and Jesus was representing the Jewish community in that struggle. So Jesus could have said, I order you to make peace with the Romans, or I order you to resolve your conflict with the Romans, or I order you to negotiate a treaty with the Romans. And believe me, these things would have been as revolutionary for many Jews as saying loving the enemy. But Jesus jumped all of this and went to that extreme of loving the enemy. What I started realizing is that when Jesus talks about loving an enemy, loving someone, I remembered when I got married that we were standing in church, me and my wife, and the pastor said, in this new relationship, oneness is created, as if a new reality is created. So what Jesus calls us to do is that create oneness. Because when you love somebody, you're not just loving them when things are good. You're loving them continuously, in the good, the bad, and sometimes very ugly. You're always there with them, celebrating their joys, mourning their sorrows, having full compassion with them. You become one in the body of Christ with those who you have labeled as an enemy. So what Jesus is calling us to do is to begin to challenge our own selves and how we perceive our identity. And do we actually see our identity through His lens or through our lens? And once we see it through His lens, then we are able to connect with others in ways that we have never been able to before. Loving somebody means understanding who they are. When I first met my wife, she was a beautiful woman, and I fell in love with her. But to build this long-term relationship with her, I had to actually know who she was. A real relationship of love. And what Jesus calls me then as a Palestinian to do is to understand who my enemy is. And until that point, my enemy was a soldier, was a settler, was a bad Israeli politician, was the checkpoint, was the wall, was the settlements, was the laws of oppression that I faced. And then Jesus says, I want you to find out who your enemy is. The answer came very quickly when I started asking the question who my enemy was. A week later, a Jewish couple, friends of mine from the US, called me. Her name is Eve Marco, and Eve said, Sami, I want to invite you to go with me and Bernie on a pilgrimage. And of course, I laugh at Eve, and I say, Eve, I live in Bethlehem. People come here on pilgrimage. Where do you want me to go with you on pilgrimage? And she said, I want you to come with us and join us in a retreat in a very, very cold country called Poland. To go to Poland on pilgrimage. And she said, I want you to come with us and visit the death camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau, where the Holocaust happened. And that shocked me. I never ever thought that I would even think about visiting death camps in Europe where the Holocaust happened. It's not to say that Palestinians are Holocaust denials. We actually don't deny the Holocaust because we like to be claimed as the victims of the most victimized people in the world, the Jewish people. And then she says, Sam, I want you to come with us. And she had no idea that I'm having this conversation with God. And I went there, and it was, until this day, I really can't describe how powerful of an experience it was to really begin to see who my enemy is. And to begin to realize that my enemy, as strong as they are, as macho as they are, as much as they hide behind arms and security and military power and economic power, at the end of the day, they are this traumatized little child who survived the Holocaust camps. And out of the survival, and due to the lack of healing and closure for the pain and suffering of the Jewish people, they had to create this sense of security and need to protect themselves, no matter who pays the price, even if it's the Palestinians. And so my journey in life has been now where I am, is to really begin to understand that how we as Christians sometimes we demonize and dehumanize others, which is exactly what God doesn't want us to do. How easily it is for us to label people as bad and evil, which God doesn't want us to do. But is continuously challenging us, challenging me, challenging you to go behind what is the two-dimensional story that we create and ask what makes this person become like this? And how can we engage in what actually Jesus did a lot of work, which is healing work? That's what Jesus did when he was here. He talked a lot, but he healed a lot as well. This is the challenge for us. And it's not easy, as I said, because the sad reality now is that as Palestinians and Israelis, we actually have become addicted to the game of victimization. We love to play the victim's card all the time. The problem is, as a Palestinian, I could come here and give you 100 reasons why peace is not happening in the Holy Land because of the fault of Israelis. And you'll all shake your head and say, yeah, he's right. Next week, you'll have an Israeli come here, maybe, and he'll give you 100 reasons why it's the Palestinian fault there is no peace. And you'll shake your head and say, yeah, he's right. And then what do you do about it? Nothing. So I'll end by making a call. And especially having these settings with you is so important, because for me, I look at this as the church, as the future Christian leaders of this country and the world. No pressure. We are called to be peacemakers. We are called to engage in what everybody perceives as impossible. The challenge the church has missed when it comes to peacemaking in the Holy Land is that for the longest time, we've played 3 or 4 roles that I think have not been positive. The first role is that the church has said, this is too complicated, I cannot get involved. And you hear this by many pastors saying, this is too complicated. Again, it's been going on for thousands of years. When God comes, let him deal with it. That's one way of dealing with conflict that the church has done, not just in this conflict, in other conflicts. When it's too big for us, when it's not clearly defined in terms of black and white, we just throw it to the future or throw it to God. God, you take care of it. The second mistake that the church has done in the conflict in the Holy Land, and again, you could connect this with other conflicts, is that we think we have to take sides. You have some churches that are pro-Israel, fully supporting Israel no matter what Israel does, right or wrong. And you have other churches that are pro-Palestinian. They support the Palestinians no matter what the Palestinians do, right or wrong. The problem is that I actually know pastors in the US who do not talk with each other because of our conflict 10,000 miles away. What a breakdown in church, in community when that happens. So the challenge is not to be pro one side and anti the other. We are called to be pro-Palestinian, pro-Israelis, pro-peace, pro-justice, pro-equality for all the people. The third challenge the church is engaging in, that I think is also another big mistake, is that the church sometimes treats the Holy Land like Disneyland. It's a nice tourist destination. And we go there, we pay lots of money, and we complain about everything, especially the long lines to the churches. That this is our holy, sacred site. This is where our Messiah was born. This is where our religion was born. We need to honor the land. We need to honor the holy sites, and we need to honor the people in this land. So we are called to be peacemakers in the land where our Christ was born. So this is the challenge we're up against. How can we reframe the role of the church when it comes to peacemaking? And as I said, not just in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but in the context of any conflict that we see. We are called to heal the wounds of the past. We are called to bring reconciliation in the present and create a future where God and His kingdom are honored. Thank you for your listening, and God bless you all.